a whisper rose from a locked room, a final note played not in melody, but in warning. Something was hidden beneath the harmony, something that killed without a sound. A death with no wound, a crime without a trace, only a single discordant chord left behind to speak the truth. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was upon a grim March morning, the kind that pressed down upon London like a damp woolen shroud, that I found myself once again at our familiar hearth in Baker Street, seated across from my friend and companion, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The fire sputtered dutifully in the grate, its feeble warmth no match for the chill that crept beneath the window sill. Outside, the street was scarcely visible through the thick fog that hung low upon the city, muffling the clip of hooves and the occasional clatter of cartwheels. Holmes sat in the armchair opposite mine, long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed not upon the paper in his lap, but on some inward theatre of thought. He had spoken little that morning, a sure sign that the machinery of his mind was in motion. It was during such silences that I had grown to appreciate the subtleties of his temperament. The commonplace world receded, and in its place emerged a more curious realm, where nothing was too trivial to escape analysis, and the faintest detail might bear the weight of revelation. It was in this state of near trance that a peculiar sound from the street drew him suddenly upright. The noise had been faint, a discordant strain rising from the fog, no louder than a breath of wind, but Holmes's keen ears had seized upon it as though it were a gunshot. "Did you mark that, Watson?" he asked, his eyes now alight with a glint I had come to associate with impending adventure. I shook my head. "A cart, perhaps. Someone moving a piano." "Precisely," he said, rising from his seat and moving to the window. "But not merely any piano. The sound you heard, faint and fleeting though it was, contained an error too deliberate to be accidental. A G-sharp struck against a C major chord, but held too long, as if by intent." I joined him at the window, but could discern little beyond the shadows of men and machinery dissolving into the morning fog. "You astonish me, Holmes," I said. "You can divine intent from a passing chord?" "A great deal, my dear Watson," he replied. The instrument was of modest build, yet the resonance bespoke craftsmanship uncommon in street parlours. Moreover, the dissonance, ugly though it sounded, bore the fingerprints of a trained hand. Surely not every clumsy touch upon a piano carries such implication. "Not every touch," Holmes said, turning from the glass with the faintest of smiles. "But this one does." That chord was a message. Holmes crossed the room to his modest collection of musical scores, many of them annotated in his own careful hand. After several minutes of sifting, he withdrew a thin volume, bound in faded blue linen, and laid it upon the table. "You are familiar, no doubt, with the fugues of Gaspard Leclerc." "I cannot say that I am," I admitted. "My musical education is regrettably limited." "An obscure French composer of the late 18th century, Holmes replied, known only to a handful of scholars. He developed a system of harmonic encryption, chords arranged not for beauty, but to conceal. The dissonance you heard was one of his signatures. He tapped a passage near the end of the score. This pattern, see how the G-sharp contradicts the key. It is identical to what we heard moments ago. But what does it signify? I asked. Uncertainty, warning, possibly even threat, Holmes said quietly. Leclerc's method was used to encode names, dates, confessions. To the trained ear, such a phrase would be as legible as ink upon paper. I studied the score in silence, awed less by the theory than by Holmes's absolute certainty. It was as if the air itself had spoken to him, and he alone had understood its meaning. Holmes closed the score and returned it to the shelf with the care one might reserve for a relic. He stood for a moment in thought, eyes half-lidded, listening once more for a sound that had long since vanished into the grey veil of London's morning. "Someone out there is playing a game, Watson," he said at last, "and like all games worth playing, it is one of concealment and revelation." "You believe a crime has occurred?" "No, not yet," he murmured, "but I believe one is forming, taking shape beneath the quiet surface of things, and when it breaks, it shall be with the sharpness of that chord." As he returned to his chair, the fire casting slender shadows across his face, I felt the strange, electric stillness that always preceded the arrival of some perplexing visitor. Holmes, I knew, had already heard footsteps we had not yet seen. My speculation that morning had scarcely formed into words when Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor. The name she provided, Miss Lenora Valence, held no immediate recognition for either Holmes or myself, yet the gravity in her tone suggested that this was no casual caller. The young lady who entered our sitting room moments later was of a stature both elegant and severe. She was dressed in mourning, her dark attire rendered more striking by the pallor of her face, which was composed almost to the point of frost. Yet even the most deliberate stillness cannot wholly conceal emotion, and I observed in her manner something beyond grief, a tightness about the mouth, a slight tremor at the fingertips, and the careful modulation of breath that betrayed deep internal disquiet. Holmes had risen at once and offered her the seat nearest the fire. "You have suffered a loss, Miss Valence," he said, with that peculiar gentleness which he reserved for moments of earnest tragedy. "Please do not trouble yourself with preambles. Begin where the burden lies heaviest." "I thank you, Mr. Holmes," she replied, her voice steady but low. "It is not only grief that brings me here, but a fear I cannot yet name. My brother Augustus was found dead 2 nights ago, in a room locked from the inside, and though I am told it was suicide, I cannot believe it." Holmes said nothing, but in that silence I saw the unmistakable flicker of interest behind his gaze. She spoke with precision, though it was clear that each word came at a cost. "My brother was a composer," she said. "Though he rarely performed publicly, his work was well respected in private circles. We lived together at Valence Manor in Surrey, where he maintained a music room on the upper floor. It was his refuge, and in recent months, his prison." Holmes inclined his head slightly, prompting her to continue. "2 nights ago, just before midnight, I heard the piano, one long solitary note, discordant and strange. I rose from bed and went to the music room, but the door was locked. That was not unusual. Augustus often worked in solitude. Yet, something in that note unsettled me." She paused, and her fingers unconsciously laced together in her lap. "I returned again in the morning. Still no answer. I fetched the housekeeper and demanded the door be forced open. When it was, we found him seated at the piano, slumped forward, his hand resting on the keys. He was already cold." Her voice faltered at last, and she looked away. "And there was something else," she said, almost in a whisper. "A torn sheet of music lay beside him. 1 bar only, hastily inked. The chord was jarring, wrong. Augustus would never have written such a thing. It was a cry, I think. A message." Holmes interlaced his fingers. "A single dissonant chord?" "Yes. And the room, no sign of intrusion, no marks upon the window?" "None. Everything was locked precisely as he had left it." It was, I confess, a chilling account. Holmes sat forward, the gleam now fully returned to his eye. "A locked room, a strange chord, and a death that resists explanation. You were right to come, Miss Valence." "The particulars, if you please," Holmes said, reaching for his notebook. "Let us have the details as precisely as memory will permit." Miss Valence drew a slow breath. The music room was untouched. My brother's body sat upon the piano bench, as though he had simply stopped mid-phrase. The door was locked from the inside. There is only one key, and it was found upon his person. The window was shut and latched. There were no signs of forced entry. And the piano? Holmes asked. A Bösendorfer grand. Augustus kept it in immaculate condition. The lid was locked when we entered. Holmes looked up sharply. Locked? Yes, she confirmed, and with the same key found in his pocket. The lid covered the strings entirely. That is unusual, Holmes murmured. He had become increasingly withdrawn in recent weeks, she continued. Spoke less of his compositions and more of hidden messages. He believed that music was a cipher, that certain patterns could reveal truths not meant for words. I could not help but glance at Holmes, who remained still as stone. He became convinced, she said softly, that someone was listening to his work, not for pleasure, but for what was concealed beneath. He said once that a man could be murdered over a single, unresolved chord. Holmes finally rose from his chair. Miss Vallance, you have presented me with a problem both unique and profound. I suspect that your brother's death was neither poetic nor purposeless. She stood as well. Then you will investigate? With your permission, I shall begin immediately. Miss Vallance inclined her head, the stiffness of her manner yielding for the first time to a faint expression of relief. I am grateful, Mr. Holmes, she said. I know not what remains to be discovered, but I could not endure another hour believing his death to be senseless. I make no promises, Miss Vallance, Holmes replied. Only that I shall look without presumption and listen without haste. The truth often hides in the noise we are taught to ignore. As she departed, Holmes returned to his armchair, steepling his fingers once more. He remained silent until the sound of her carriage wheels had faded into the fog. You observed the change in her voice, Watson? He said at last. I did, I replied. She began with composure, but the further she described that room, the more it faltered. Indeed, because she has seen something, though she does not yet know it. You suspect foul play, then? I suspect intelligence, Watson, subtle musical intelligence. A locked room implies a closed circle, yet the sound of that chord was an opening. Someone knew how to close the scene, but not how to mute the message. He stood, lit a match with care, and turned once more to the fog-bound window. Pack your bag, Watson. We shall take the 4:15 to Surrey. I believe the late Augustus Vallance left more behind than a melody. We arrived in Surrey beneath a sky the colour of dull pewter, the wind carrying with it the scent of thawing earth and distant rain. The countryside, still gripped by the last grasp of winter, seemed to hold its breath as we made our way by hired trap along a narrow lane flanked by hedgerows bereft of leaf or life. I could not help but feel that even nature had drawn back from Vallance Manor, as though reluctant to bear witness to whatever tragedy lay within. The house itself came into view as we crested a small hill, a brooding silhouette of stone and ivy, its windows shuttered and its chimneys long since cold. It was not a place that welcomed. Holmes, however, was unmoved by such impressions. He surveyed the structure with the dispassion of a cartographer studying foreign terrain. A maid admitted us at once, and we were led without ceremony through a hall of oak panels and threadbare carpet, past portraits whose eyes seemed to follow our passage. Miss Vallance met us at the foot of the staircase and bade us proceed with her upstairs. Nothing has been altered since that night, she assured us, her voice taut. The room remains locked. Only I possess the key. Holmes nodded. Then let us disturb the silence together. I followed them upward, the air growing heavier with each step, until we stood before the music room, the very threshold where art had given way to death. Miss Vallance turned the key in the lock and stepped aside. Holmes entered first, and I followed behind, bracing myself instinctively for some trace of horror. But the room, at first glance, offered no violence, only stillness. It was a spacious chamber, its walls lined with shelves of manuscript and theory, its sole illumination the grey light that filtered through the tall, curtained window. At the centre stood the grand piano, its dark wood gleaming with the care of years. A chair rested before it, its legs neatly aligned, and there, beside it, still untouched, lay the torn scrap of sheet music Miss Valence had described, resting as though placed with deliberation atop the lid. Holmes did not speak. He circled the room slowly, eyes passing over the furnishings, the floorboards, the window latch, and at last the piano itself. I noted the way he paused beside the bench, stooping to examine the pedals, then ran his fingers lightly across the lid, stopping when his touch met a small lock inset above the keyboard. No sign of forced entry, he murmured. And yet... He turned to the sheet of music. I peered over his shoulder and saw a single chord scrawled hastily across the bar. I knew little of notation, but even I could sense that it was wrong. Harsh, unresolved. A cry, Holmes said, but not for help. A riddle. He withdrew his magnifying lens and spent several minutes inspecting the hinges of the piano lid and the nearby floorboards. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly. "Death does not always arrive in thunder. Sometimes it plays pianissimo." His tone was not flippant, but reverent. He had seen something, of that I was certain. Yet as he turned back to the locked window, he said only, "Let us catalogue the anomalies." Holmes knelt beside the piano and tapped gently along the surface of the lid, pausing near the lower edge, where the wood gave a slightly hollow tone. He noted it silently, then turned his attention to the keyboard itself. One key, the leftmost A, was chipped at the corner, a detail he examined with care. "Such a blemish would not escape a man like Augustus Valence," Holmes murmured. "It is either damage recent or deliberately left." Next he approached the window. Though firmly latched from within, the sill bore faint marks, scrapes upon the woodwork just below the handle. He traced them with his forefinger. "Someone attempted entry, or exit," I ventured. "Perhaps," Holmes said. "But if so, they left no mud, no prints. The disturbance is curious, not conclusive." By the corner of the room, near the door, he bent to retrieve a half-melted candle stub. It was no longer than my thumb, and had been left near the leg of a bookshelf, where it might easily be overlooked. "A second source of light?" I asked. Holmes did not answer at once. He held the candle up to the light, studying the wax's edge. "Not from this room," he said at last. "There are no matching holders here." Lastly, he examined the floorboards beneath the piano. There, just beneath the left pedal, a faint scratch arced across the parquet. Shallow, but fresh. He stood. 4 signs: a broken key, a scratched floor, a candle out of place, and a scuffed sill. Singularly meaningless. Collectively, they speak. Of what? He gave me a rare smile. Of conversation yet to come. We descended from the music room and requested to speak with the staff. Miss Valence summoned the housekeeper, a woman of austere bearing named Mrs. Weatherby, whose manner suggested a lifetime of grievances, many of them nursed to full maturity. Holmes greeted her politely. "You were the one who accompanied Miss Valence when the room was opened." "I was," she replied curtly, "and I saw what she saw. The boy was dead and nothing could change it." "He was not a boy, Mrs. Weatherby," Miss Valence interjected quietly. The housekeeper sniffed. "He never left that room. What would I know of what he became?" Holmes folded his arms. "May I ask whether any strangers visited the house in recent weeks? Musicians, tradesmen, anyone unscheduled?" "Not to my knowledge," she said flatly. "And if they did, they'd have gone to the back door, not through the front like lords." "Did Mr. Valence ever speak with you about his music?" She gave a sour laugh. "Spoke to no one. Lately, he'd taken to muttering to himself. Whole hours he'd spend in there, hammering out those unnatural tunes." Holmes tilted his head. You disapproved of his work. I disapproved of madness, she said, and that room was full of it. Miss Vallance flinched but said nothing. The housekeeper's words had the bluntness of old wounds. Thank you, Holmes said, signalling the interview's end. As Mrs. Weatherby departed, I turned to him. Unpleasant woman, I murmured. Yes, Holmes agreed, but not uninformative. She loathes the girl and feared the man. That makes her useful. What do you suppose she hides? He looked toward the staircase. A candle, perhaps, or something that burns more slowly. The following morning brought with it a drizzle of cold rain and the arrival of Mr. Nathaniel Ives, the late Mr. Vallance's long-serving piano tuner. He was a man of middle years, narrow in shoulder and slight in build, with fingers that twitched perpetually against the brim of his hat. His eyes, though pale and downcast, darted upward at intervals with a furtiveness that did not escape Holmes. I was summoned regularly, sir, Ives said, his voice thin and scratchy as a bow drawn across worn strings. Mr. Vallance insisted on precision. When was your last visit? Holmes asked. 3 weeks ago, sir, just after the first frost. Any complaints from your employer? Not directly, Ives admitted, glancing toward the door. But he was different. Kept to shadows, watched me too closely, spoke strange things under his breath. Music that don't sound like music, if you take my meaning. I take it precisely, Holmes said. Did he show you any new compositions? None. He'd stopped sharing his work. Was the piano in good order? As far as I could tell, said Ives, hesitating, though the bottom register had been tampered with. In what way? He shifted uncomfortably. He'd removed some of the damper felt near the bass strings, said he liked the resonance, sounded strange to me, hollow. Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me, then returned his gaze to Ives. Thank you, Mr. Ives. That will be all, for now. As the man turned to go, I noticed his right hand trembling with greater force than before, as though the very memory of the music room unsettled him. Holmes remained silent, yet I knew the piano tuner had struck a discordant note within my friend's deeper reasoning. Later that afternoon, we received a visit from Mr. Basil Kemble, a violinist of minor repute and, as he explained, a close associate of Augustus Vallance during his earlier years in the Royal Academy. I had not seen him in months, Kemble said, his face drawn with weariness, but we corresponded often, letters as cryptic as his compositions. He believed music was a language older than speech, and that certain combinations of notes could carry meanings that words would fail to hold. Holmes inclined his head. And did he share these beliefs with you? Only in fragments, said Kemble. He once sent me a sequence of chords that, when transposed and rearranged, spelled the word lamento using solfège notation. He considered it an art form. I did not. Holmes raised his brows slightly. Did you believe he had lost touch with reason? Kemble sighed. He had grown erratic, yes, but he was not mad. He was chasing something, a pattern, a code, a meaning. He believed someone was watching him, not as a critic, but as a spy. I leaned forward. Did he suspect anyone in particular? There was a man, Kemble said, frowning. A Mr. Tyers, I think. Augustus mentioned him only once, and even then with hesitation. Holmes's pencil, already hovering over his notebook, came to rest. And did he link this man to the music? Kemble nodded. He said Tyers was listening in ways most men cannot. As the musician departed, I turned to Holmes, whose features bore the deep stillness that I had come to recognize as thought in motion. You've heard that name before, I said. Holmes gave no answer, but in the silence, I felt the case take on its darker shape, as though an unseen key had been pressed within Holmes's mind. The remainder of the day passed in near silence. We remained at Valence Manor by Miss Lenora's invitation, and after supper, Holmes retired to the study with a sheaf of papers, his violin, and an expression I knew well. He did not speak, nor request light or assistance. Only the faint creak of the chair and the occasional whisper of bow upon string betrayed the passage of hours. I observed him from the corner of the room, a spectator to his contemplations. He alternated between sketching strange geometries upon the backs of envelopes and sounding out brief, awkward intervals on the violin, some so dissonant they set my teeth on edge. At one point, he paused with his bow lifted in the air, as if holding a thought on the brink of expression. When at last he broke the silence, it was not to deliver a conclusion, but a question. "Watson, how many coincidences are required before one sees intention?" I hesitated. More than one, I should think. 2, perhaps. But 3. "Indeed," he murmured, returning to his notes. "We have a chipped key, a missing candle, a scuff near a locked window, and a tuner whose hands betray more than his words. 4 coincidences, and none in harmony." I stepped forward. "Do you believe Augustus Valence was murdered?" Holmes set his violin aside. "I believe he was silenced, and if I am correct, Watson, the next note has not yet been played." That night, the house lay in stillness, disturbed only by the distant creak of timbers and the quiet shiftings of the wind. Holmes had requested that we remain in the music room after the others had retired, and I obliged without question. There was something in his bearing that evening, an intensity veiled in composure, that told me he had drawn near the contours of truth. He moved with deliberate care, testing each key of the grand piano one by one, pausing at intervals to press his ear closer to the frame. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a taper, and the solemn ritual of sound and silence lent the space the aura of a chapel. When his fingers struck a key in the lower register, a C, I believe, the tone rang not in the air, but somewhere deeper, as though a hollow chamber had responded beneath. "There," Holmes murmured. "Did you hear it?" "I did," I whispered. "It echoed unnaturally." Holmes nodded. "Not the note itself, but the cavity beneath. Sound reveals what sight cannot. Something lies within." He retrieved a small brass tool from his coat and knelt beside the instrument, examining the seams and joints with practiced eyes. The suspicion that had haunted him since our arrival now stirred to certainty. "Watson," he said, almost reverently, "we are not listening to an instrument alone, but to its secrets, and secrets, when pressed, are seldom silent." Without another word, he began to work at the casing. With painstaking delicacy, Holmes loosened the screws near the treble edge of the instrument and gently pried back a panel of the piano's interior casing. I held the candle steady, and in its flickering glow, the mechanism of the soundboard glistened with dust and shadow. But there, just above the lowest bass strings, something foreign had been embedded, a compartment, scarcely the size of a small book, its contours disguised beneath a strip of lacquered wood. Holmes tapped lightly against it, producing a dull, hollow response. "This was not part of the original construction," he said. "It has been added with cunning, and for concealment, not resonance." He drew out his penknife and, with a surgeon's care, dislodged the panel. Inside was a narrow cavity, and within it, a bundle of folded manuscript pages tied with an aged ribbon. Holmes removed them and handed the bundle to me. They were musical compositions, but unlike those I had seen before. Entire bars were crossed through with thick ink strokes, annotations scrawled in the margins, and on one page, a curious diagram. Half-staff notation, half cipher, scratched out in trembling hand. "What do you make of it?" I asked. Holmes glanced at the bundle. "A draft, or a confession. Perhaps both," He replaced the panel, restoring the piano's facade, and stood. "Someone searched for this," he said quietly. "Perhaps they did not find it, or perhaps they did, and left it behind as bait." He did not elaborate further, but I knew we had passed from observation into danger. We returned the documents to Miss Valance's safekeeping and retired, though I confess that sleep eluded me. Some hours must have passed when I was roused by the sharp scent of smoke and the low crackle of flame. I threw on my coat and raced down the stairs, only to find Holmes already ahead of me, his silhouette framed by orange light spilling from the study doorway. Within, a portion of the hearth rug smouldered, and the air was thick with smoke. A pile of sheet music had been gathered near the fireplace and set alight. Holmes, using the hem of his greatcoat, extinguished the remaining flames with brisk efficiency. Miss Valance appeared moments later, pale and disoriented. "What has happened?" "Someone attempted to destroy these," Holmes said, gesturing to the charred remains. "But why?" she asked, aghast. "That," Holmes replied, "is precisely the question they hoped we would never ask." I inspected the papers. Most were irreparably damaged, but a few had only singed edges, pages of original compositions, all bearing the notations of Augustus Valance's hand. Holmes turned to the door and examined the handle. Unforced. The culprit had means and time. "Then it was someone within the house?" I asked. "Or someone who knows it as well as those who live here," Holmes replied. We stood for a moment in the smoke-thick air, the smell of scorched ink and parchment curling into our lungs. Holmes bent to pick up an unburnt sliver of wax near the carpet edge. "A candle," he murmured. "One that has burned twice." By morning, the household was abuzz with confusion. Mrs. Weatherby, the housekeeper, had not emerged from her quarters, nor responded to repeated knocks. When at last her door was forced open, it revealed only a sparsely packed valise upon the bed and an open window whose latch hung loose against the sill. She had vanished without word or farewell. Holmes inspected the chamber in silence. Upon the floor beneath the window, he found a smudge of soot, and upon the small dressing table, a stub of candle that matched precisely the one discovered in the study. "She left in haste," he said, "but not in fear. She departed with purpose and likely under cover of darkness." Miss Valance was visibly shaken by the discovery. "You don't suppose she was responsible for the fire?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He turned the candle stub over in his palm and regarded the scorched cloth of the hearth rug, now folded and removed from the study. "She may have lit the flame," he said at last. "But it is not always the hand that strikes the match we must fear. It is the mind that selects the tinder." I could see then that he was beginning to connect the scattered threads now taut and fraying. Later that day, as the sun struggled behind veils of cloud, I found Holmes alone in the drawing room, gazing out at the skeletal trees beyond the window. The bundle of rescued sheet music lay untouched on the table beside him, as though he had no need to consult it further. He spoke without turning. "Desperation, Watson, is a poor companion to secrecy. Someone within this circle is losing their grasp upon both." I seated myself across from him. "Do you suspect Miss Valance?" "Not of guilt," Holmes said. "But perhaps of omission. She has told us all she believes she knows, but not all that she fears. You believe she is in danger?" "I believe," he said slowly, "that her brother composed more than music, and whatever melody he left behind was not meant for ears, but for eyes, and the eyes that discovered it are growing nervous." He folded his hands. "They will act again, soon." I awoke to a curious sound, a gasp, faint and strangled, followed by the sharp rapping of knuckles upon my door. I was up in an instant, my medical instincts aroused, and found Holmes already crossing the corridor, his robe hastily drawn around him. "It came from Miss Valance's room," he said, low and quick. We entered without ceremony. The air struck me first, thick with a chemical sweetness I knew all too well from my years in practice. A decanter of water had been spilled across the rug, and near the window Miss Lenora Valance lay half reclined in a chair, her head drooped to one side, her breath shallow. I knelt at once, examining her pulse and pupils. "Chloroform," I said. "Applied hastily, and in small quantity, likely on a cloth. She is not deeply unconscious." Holmes retrieved a discarded handkerchief from the floor. No monogram, coarse linen, faintly damp. "There was no struggle," he observed. "No sign of theft, nor any rummaging of drawers. Whoever entered came for her alone, and left with nothing." I opened the window to let in air, and as I did so, I noticed the latch had been left ajar. "She shall recover in a matter of minutes," I said. Holmes nodded grimly. "Yes, but this is not over." When Miss Valance stirred, she did so with a start, her eyes wide, confused, and glistening with tears that did not fall. "You must rest," I told her gently. But Holmes, from the shadows, watched her in silence, his expression unreadable. When Miss Valance was at last assisted back to bed, Holmes remained behind in the room, moving as quietly as a priest before the altar. He examined the edges of the window frame, the rug, and the wardrobe hinges. I stood at the threshold, noting that his silence was not one of uncertainty, but calculation. He turned to me after several minutes. The object was not larceny, nor even injury. It was fear. "To instill it?" I asked. "Precisely," he replied. The intruder entered with care, administered the chloroform, and departed with equal caution. Nothing was taken, yet everything was said. But why risk exposure to frighten her? Because someone is growing anxious. Lenora may know more than she realizes, or may be near to discovering something herself. He returned to the window and tested the latch again. Unsecured, deliberately. A message in gesture. No locks hold meaning when the mind they guard is vulnerable. I glanced once more at the trembling candle on the nightstand, its wax fresh. "Another coincidence?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson. A composition is emerging, not a symphony, but a pattern, and one intended to silence before it is heard." His voice was soft, but in it, I heard danger gathering. When Miss Valance regained full consciousness, she was pale and quiet, her voice reduced to a whisper. I don't understand," she said. "I have no enemies, no debts. I have lived quietly. Who would wish me harm?" Holmes, seated beside her with all the poise of a physician or priest, regarded her steadily. "There are many forms of harm," he said. "Some wish to injure the body, others the mind, and some merely wish silence." She met his gaze, but I saw the flicker, an involuntary hesitation in the eyes that betrays the careful sifting of memory. "Miss Valance," he continued, "did your brother leave anything unfinished? A letter, a sketch, a message you have not shared with us?" "No," she said at once, too quickly. Holmes did not challenge her. He merely inclined his head in a gesture of gratitude and stood. "Then let us speak no more of it." But as we left her chamber, I turned to him. "You believe she lied?" "No," he said. "She believes what she said, but belief is a fragile substitute for truth." "Then what remains?" He paused at the top of the stairs. "Music, Watson. We must return to the piano. It has not yet told us everything it knows." The music room had grown colder with each passing hour, though whether this was the fault of the weather or the weight of discovery, I could not say. Holmes sat once more at the grand piano, the lid now unlocked, his fingers resting lightly on the keys. He pressed a chord. It was the same sequence we had heard faintly from the street on that first morning, a cluster of notes, wrong and lingering, that seemed to clash within the ear. He struck it again, slowly, deliberately. "This," he said, is not merely dissonance. It is design. I stepped closer, unsure what to listen for. You believe it to be a cipher? I believe it to be a language, Holmes replied. Musical cryptography has a long history. Patterns of chord and interval used to encode names, dates, even entire sentences. The late Mr. Vallance believed in such methods. I am inclined to believe he applied them. He struck each note individually now, calling out the intervals as he did so. G sharp, C, F natural. From the table, he retrieved the sheet we had found beside Augustus's body and held it against the light. Observe the placement of the ledger lines here, he said. This is not notation. It is spacing, rhythm not of melody, but of information. And what does it say? Not yet clear, Holmes murmured. But the key is the signature, what he knew only he could write. He struck the chord a third time. It is his final statement. We need only learn how to read it. Holmes's investigation of the musical cipher continued well into the evening. By the lamplight, he arranged pages across the floor, matching chord patterns with manuscript fragments salvaged from the attempted fire. His movements bore none of the frenzy of inspiration, but rather the quiet momentum of inevitability, like a man completing a puzzle whose border he had already discerned. I have seen this structure before, he said at last, beckoning me to his side. It is a variation of the Leclerc cipher, an 18th century method of hiding letters through harmonic sequence. He tapped the manuscript. Each discord represents a letter. Spacing defines the order. This, he pointed, is the sequence for the letter M. This, T, and this cluster, Y-E-R-S. I read the name aloud. M. Tyers, Holmes nodded. A name hidden in sound. Then your theory was correct. The composer was not writing music. He was documenting a threat. Precisely, Holmes said. And not merely a name, but a warning. He feared this man perhaps discovered him in some illicit practice and encoded the danger into the only language he trusted. I felt a chill settle over the room. To kill a man for a chord, I whispered. It seems unimaginable. Holmes looked up. To some, Watson, silence is priceless. Holmes rose, dusted his hands, and regarded the pages now laid before us like fragments of a broken confession. You see now, he said, this was not madness nor misfortune. It was message and murder. And the motive? I asked. He looked toward the window, where the wind stirred the curtains like breath from some unseen mouth. Augustus Vallance found something, he said, something hidden in sound. And that knowledge, once acquired, could not be unlearned. It threatened someone powerful, someone practiced in secrets. He turned to me with the calm of certainty. And so, Watson, it had to be silenced. The following afternoon was spent in near total silence, broken only by the intermittent sounds of Holmes at the piano. Chord, pause, chord again. Like a language slowly relearned. He had returned to the strange harmonic structure Augustus Vallance had left behind, and in his lap lay a grid of manuscript paper scrawled with intervals, annotations, and faintly penciled letters. Look here, Watson, he said at last, beckoning me close. We begin with the assumption that this chord, dissonant, irregular, was intentional. From there, we match the structure to known ciphering methods. See this note pairing? F sharp against C natural. In Leclerc's method, that translates phonetically to a T. I peered over his shoulder. And these next bars? Y, E, R, S. The entire sequence reads M. Tyers. The name appears thrice across 3 movements of the piece, each time masked by discord. He turned to the remaining sheets. Here, again, in the finale. Each iteration more distorted, as though the composer feared recognition yet was compelled to speak. And this Tyers, a man not unknown to me, Holmes murmured. A forger of exceptional cunning, but not of paintings, Watson, of music. I stared at the notes with newfound unease. So this was not composition. It was testimony. Exactly, Holmes said, a dying man's voice hidden in harmony. He stood, gathering the pages. The time for silence is past. Let us see if our thief is willing to listen when the melody is played back to him, publicly. Over a modest supper that evening, Holmes at last offered me the full account of the man behind the cipher. Monsieur Tyers, he began, is not the villain's true name, but one of several he has employed. He surfaced first in Vienna, where a collection of supposed Mozart fragments was unmasked as his handiwork. Later, in Paris, he forged entire lost suites attributed to Vivaldi, each with hidden watermarks, codes used to convey information to criminal financiers across the continent. And you were involved? I asked. In part. I intercepted a ledger encoded in a Haydn concerto and delivered it to the French Sûreté. The forger vanished soon after. That was 5 years ago. And now he resurfaces here. Holmes nodded. My guess is that Augustus Valence stumbled upon one of his forgeries, or was asked, perhaps even coerced, to produce one himself. When he refused or sought to reveal it, he was silenced. Precisely. Holmes refilled his pipe and drew in a slow breath. What intrigues me, he said, is not only the method of the murder, but its orchestration. There is artistry here, Watson. That is what makes it dangerous. And what now? Now, Holmes replied, we give the artist a reason to reveal himself. The next morning found Holmes already engaged in correspondence, his desk strewn with sheets of music, envelopes, and a pocket directory of publishers. I have composed, he said without looking up, a short article under the name of a fictitious musicologist, extolling the discovery of an unfinished fugue attributed to Augustus Valence. And the ciphered composition, I asked, included, transposed, slightly altered, but recognizable to one who listens with purpose. The piece will be published in the Harmonium Review, a small but respected digest whose readership includes restorers, collectors, and, I suspect, forgers. He sealed the letter. The forger will see it. He will believe the cipher has been uncovered. And he will act. Won't that endanger others? I asked. It will endanger one thing only, his illusion of secrecy. Holmes posted the article himself and spent the rest of the day reviewing the mechanisms of the piano, inspecting its hinges and inner workings with renewed intensity. He made no further comment about Tyers nor of Valence's death, but I could see the tension coil behind his outward calm. As dusk fell, he turned to me. He will not strike in daylight, he said. The piano holds more than music, and he believes it still hides something. Tonight, Watson, we make ourselves part of the silence. He extinguished the lamp and gestured toward the music room. The house had grown still by midnight. Miss Valence had retired early, and the servants had been dismissed for the evening. Holmes and I concealed ourselves behind the tall velvet drapes of the music room, the grand piano gleaming faintly beneath the moonlight which filtered through the windows. Time passed slowly, marked only by the rhythm of my own breath and the soft creak of floorboards adjusting to the cold. Holmes stood motionless beside me, his profile barely visible in silhouette. He held no weapon, only the quiet assurance that logic, once properly played, is its own defense. A full hour must have passed when I heard it, a soft click at the rear of the house, followed by the muted tread of feet upon carpet. Holmes touched my arm lightly, a signal for silence. The door to the music room opened. A figure entered, cloaked in shadow, moving with the careful grace of one who knows the contours of the space intimately. He approached the piano directly, withdrew a small satchel from beneath his coat, and knelt before the instrument. With gloved hands, he reached beneath the lid and began to unscrew the base of the soundboard. Holmes moved then, swift but silent, and stepped into the faint light. "That will do, Mr. Tyers," he said evenly. The man froze, then slowly rose, his face drawn and pale in the moonlight. "Holmes," he whispered, "you're not dead after all." "Nor is the truth," Holmes replied, "but I dare say it has been poorly tuned." The man who stood before us bore little of the menace I had imagined. He was slight, scholarly in frame, with thinning hair and spectacles that glinted as he turned his face toward the light. And yet, beneath the surface calm, I sensed the danger of cunning honed by years of deceit. "You have no proof," he said. "This is my piano, my commission." "Untrue," Holmes replied. "It is the property of Miss Lenora Vallance, and you are not expected here, nor were you invited to dismantle its workings under cover of night." Tyers drew a breath. "I came only to retrieve what is mine." "You mean the ciphered confession," Holmes said. "Unfortunately for you, it was never yours to take. Augustus Vallance saw through you and paid the price for it." I stepped forward. "How was it done?" Tyers hesitated, then said, "I rigged the damper beneath the keys with a slow-acting compound, chloroform vapor, released upon key pressure, a mechanism of my own design, subtle, undetectable until the final breath." Holmes nodded, unsurprised. "You used music as your murder weapon, a fitting irony." "Fitting?" Tyers spat. "He betrayed his art. He turned sound into accusation." Holmes remained unmoved. "And you, Mr. Tyers, turned it into silence." Within minutes, the local constable had arrived, summoned in advance by Holmes's foresight. Tyers offered no further resistance. As the handcuffs closed upon his wrists, he turned once more toward the piano, the instrument he had corrupted. "It was always about the music," he said. "No," Holmes replied quietly. "It was always about the truth." The man who stood before us in the moonlit music room bore little resemblance to the fumbling, soft-spoken tuner we had encountered days earlier. His posture, though still thin and angular, had acquired a certain tension, as if the removal of his disguise had summoned the sinews of a different man altogether, one built not of frailty, but of calculation. Holmes stepped forward calmly, the light catching his features with clinical sharpness. "Mr. Tyers," he said, "or whatever name you choose to wear on a given day, you will find your performance is concluded." The man's jaw tightened, but he did not retreat. "I have committed no violence," he said. "There is no proof." Holmes gestured to the disassembled piano mechanism. "Only the attempt to tamper with a private instrument under cover of darkness, the possession of stolen manuscripts, and a history of forgery so intricate it carries your signature like watermark in vellum." "I am no murderer," the man repeated. "I came for what was mine." Holmes did not raise his voice, but it cut through the room all the same. "You came because the cipher was published. You feared exposure, not of your forgeries, but of the names hidden within them." The man glanced at the window, then at the door. "There is no escape, Tyers," Holmes said quietly. "The music is over. And you were not the composer of this final piece. You were merely its discord." He stepped back. "Now speak, before silence damns you further." There was a long silence, the kind that seems to swell with all the words unspoken. At length, Tyers, if indeed that was his name, lowered himself into the chair opposite Holmes, his face pale but composed. "It was never about the music," he said. "That was the cloak. We forged rare compositions, sheets attributed to lost masters, then seeded into collections across Europe. Some we sold to collectors, others were planted deliberately." Holmes remained motionless. "For what purpose?" "To move money," Tyers replied. "The notes, musical and otherwise, carried more than melody. Coded instructions, bank transfers, account identifiers, payment chains. Who reads music with suspicion, Holmes? Who questions a piano sonata gifted by a patron, or a fragment of manuscript passed down through a family? I could not help but interject. And Augustus Valence discovered this. Tyers nodded, his eyes hollow. He was approached, offered coin to lend his name to one such forgery, but he grew curious, too curious. He deciphered the structure. He wrote it out in variations. He played the name aloud. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And when he would not be bought, you sought to silence him. Tyers said nothing. Holmes continued, you understood the piano better than anyone, and you chose the very instrument he loved to become the tool of his demise. There was no denial, no outburst, only the faint clench of the man's jaw, and in his silence, a confession far louder than speech. Holmes stood. It is not the signature of a composer that damns a man, but that of the fraud he leaves behind. Valence, Tyers said, his voice now thinner, as though drained by the weight of his revelations, had an ear too pure for lies. I underestimated him. We all did. He leaned forward, elbows resting upon his knees. He didn't accuse me openly. He merely asked questions. He referenced pieces I hadn't touched in years. He spoke of harmonies that bore unnatural symmetry. I knew then that he had seen through the veil. You tried to dissuade him? Holmes asked. I warned him, Tyers replied. Said his obsession would bring him only ruin. That music ought to be sound, not signal. And yet you devised a composition that was both, Holmes said. So did he. Tyers gave a weary smile. Yes, and the tragedy is that his was more elegant than mine. His cipher was not in the notes themselves, but in the dissonance, in what did not belong. And what did he plan to do? Expose us, Tyers whispered. He had already sent copies to a friend. It was only a matter of time. Holmes looked to me, then back to the man. So, you made the piano his executioner. Tyers did not reply, but the silence that followed was not defiant. It was mournful. A silence filled not with malice, but with the slow collapse of a man who knew his genius had been weaponized and that the reckoning had finally arrived. Holmes rose and moved to the piano, placing a hand upon its lid as though it were not an instrument, but a witness. He turned back toward Tyers, his voice even. You selected the Bosendorfer because it allowed for customization, ample soundboard space, removable casing. You installed a reservoir within the lower frame, concealed behind a modified damper. It released chloroform vapor slowly, imperceptibly, only when specific keys were depressed. Tyers did not deny it. You calculated that Valence, in striking that precise chord, would engage the mechanism and remain seated long enough to inhale a fatal dose. He would be found slumped upon the piano, untouched, unmarked, a poet claimed by his own melancholy, a suicide without contradiction. Tyers spoke then, softly. I didn't wish to kill him. I only wished to stop him. Holmes stepped back. Intentions matter little when death follows. He gestured to the locked lid. And you locked the piano afterward? With gloves, Tyers said. I returned the night after, to seal it. Holmes gave a single nod. But you did not account for the chord. It lingered. It drew attention, a dissonance heard through fog. He looked at me then. Do you recall, Watson? That morning on Baker Street. The cart, the sound. I do, I said. That was not fate, Holmes murmured. It was a cry, one note of truth in a symphony of lies. And in that moment, I saw the rare thing behind Holmes's deduction. Not only brilliance, but grief. Tyers said nothing more. He sat in stillness, as though some inner structure had crumbled within him. His shoulders sagged, and the taut defiance of minutes earlier had slackened into something smaller, something almost pitiable. I never meant to lose control, he said finally. The scheme had rules, boundaries, but Valence. He trailed off, his eyes fixed not on us, but upon the piano. He believed music was truth, he murmured. I used it as disguise. Holmes did not answer. He merely turned to the waiting constable, who had entered silently during the confession. The man placed a firm hand upon Tyres's shoulder. I will go quietly, the prisoner said, rising without resistance. As he passed me, I caught a glimpse of the man he might have been. An artisan turned shadow, a mind turned inward by fear. And in the echoing hush that followed his departure, I realized the music had stopped, but the silence would linger for days. We returned to Baker Street 3 days after the arrest, the air of London seeming at once less oppressive and yet curiously flatter, as though a strange music had ceased and left the city in quieter keys. Holmes, though outwardly unchanged, had spoken little during the journey, his gaze fixed upon the passing countryside with an expression I could only describe as solemn satisfaction. As we stepped into our familiar lodgings, I found myself reflecting on the strange case we had left behind. A murder committed in silence, without blade or bullet, and concealed not by shadow or flight, but by harmony and form. It is curious, I remarked, setting my coat upon the hook, how a man may be killed and yet leave behind no visible wound, only a note in the air, a stain upon the soul. Holmes, seated once more in his chair, nodded. It is not the absence of evidence that puzzles Watson. It is the precision with which it was removed. A locked door suggests finality, but in truth it often conceals the most elaborate illusions. He reached for his pipe. The world prefers murder with blood. It forgets that some weapons are crafted in finer workshops than steel. Holmes spoke that evening with deliberate calm, the events of the past week distilled in his mind to their clearest arrangement. The genius of the act lay not in its violence but in its restraint, he said. The room was locked, yes, but only from within. A key found upon the victim, a window secured, and a door fastened behind him. It had all the markings of suicide, or of a death by natural collapse. And yet, I replied, there was no natural cause. Indeed, Holmes said, because the method was neither external nor overt. It resided in the very object with which the victim communed most often, his piano, a trusted companion turned traitor. I recalled the room, the gleaming instrument, the position of the body, the unfinished chord. Tyres created not only a physical trap, Holmes continued, but a psychological one. He knew Valence would sit to play, and that he would return to a specific motif, the one containing the encoded name. The pressure of his fingers upon the chipped key activated a concealed mechanism. But why the locked door? Holmes steepled his fingers. Because a locked door halts inquiry. It suggests privacy, not foul play. The illusion was elegant. In truth, the murder occurred in plain sight. While all believed it to have taken place within the victim's troubled mind, he glanced toward the fireplace. The door was never the prison, Watson. It was the decoy. Holmes rose and crossed to his desk, retrieving a sketch he had drawn during our time at Valence Manor. He spread it upon the table, an annotated diagram of the Bosendorfer Grand, its undercarriage rendered with clinical detail. The key to the crime, both literal and figurative, lay in the lower bass register. Tyres had hollowed a section of the soundboard and inserted a narrow canister of chloroform beneath it. The seal was thin, responsive to weight, and connected by a slight spring trigger to the chipped A key. He tapped the sketch with his forefinger. When the key was pressed, particularly during sustained chords that Valence was known to favour, the trigger depressed, and the vapour was released in minute amounts, slowly, silently, lethally. I examined the drawing. And the piano lid, locked afterward? Tyres returned after the deed, locking the lid with the same key he knew would be found upon the victim's person. That, in turn, reinforced the illusion that Valence had simply collapsed mid-composition, perhaps overcome by grief or exhaustion. But how could you be certain? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. Because the chipped key was not worn from age. It had been scored recently, sharp enough to catch a finger, but precise enough to conceal a hidden mechanism. He folded the sketch. Murder by melody, Watson. Not the slash of a knife nor the crack of a pistol, but the final fatal note in a dying man's fugue. Holmes leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the ceiling as if following the spectral notes of that sinister chord. Augustus Valence was not only a composer, but a man of conscience, he said. He recognized the danger concealed behind the commission, and when confronted with a choice, he chose truth. But he also knew the risk, and so he embedded his warning not in words, but in music. He paused, then added quietly, "It was a message meant for no one in particular, and yet for anyone with the ear to hear it." I said nothing for a moment, struck anew by the intricacy of it all, the trust in harmony, the cry encoded in discord. "He must have known he might die," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "but he believed that sound, however buried, would outlive silence." He turned his eyes to me then, thoughtful. "That is what separates an artist from a conspirator, Watson. The conspirator hides to remain unseen. The artist hides so that someone, somewhere, will one day see." The fire had burned low. The shadows danced across the walls. Holmes reached for his violin and drew a single, mournful note. "That," he said softly, "is the sound of a man who refused to be silent." In the days that followed our return to Baker Street, I found myself dwelling upon the man whose death had cast such a curious shadow over our brief sojourn in Surrey. Augustus Valence had lived and died in silence, or so the world believed. And yet, in retracing the melody he left behind, I had come to see that silence not as emptiness, but as a veil through which he had whispered his final truths. He was, by all accounts, a recluse, a figure wrapped in solitude, whose obsession with harmony and cryptic construction had distanced him from his sister, his peers, and perhaps even from himself. But there was, in that isolation, a defiant artistry. The same mind that could build cathedrals of sound could also hide a name, a warning, a cry, in the spaces between its notes. There was a tragic irony in it all. Music, the one realm in which he had found order and meaning, had become the very medium of his undoing. A fugue meant to protect had drawn the final breath from his lungs. A chord struck not in triumph, but in despair, had brought his story to its end. And yet, perhaps, not entirely. For if that chord had gone unheard, if the dissonance had passed through fog and city unnoticed, the crime would have faded into the grey folds of obscurity. But Holmes had heard it, and in that act of listening, pure, analytical, unflinching, he had restored meaning to a man the world had dismissed as mad. In the quiet aftermath, I found myself wondering how many others had cried out in code, and how many messages had simply vanished, unread, unplayed. Valence had written a truth. Holmes had uncovered it. I was only its witness. That evening, a hush fell over our sitting room at Baker Street, the kind of stillness that follows not exhaustion, but reflection. The fire burned low in the grate, casting slow-moving shadows upon the walls. Holmes sat in his chair, his long fingers pressed together in repose, the violin resting untouched beside him. I had taken to the corner, reading without reading, the book in my hands forgotten as my thoughts returned again and again to Valence and the fate he had suffered. There was a melancholy about Holmes that evening, a gravity beneath the surface, as though the echo of that terrible chord still resounded somewhere beyond the reach of sound. At length I said, "You saved her, Holmes, Miss Valence, and you gave her brother's death meaning." Holmes did not look at me. The meaning was already there, Watson. I merely revealed its structure. He turned toward the hearth and added, almost as an afterthought, no melody exists without silence. But some silences are unnatural, forced. This was such a case. There was nothing more to be said. The flames crackled. The city beyond our window hummed faintly with life. But here, in this narrow room, music had given way to memory. It was some time later, perhaps nearing midnight, when Holmes finally stirred from his reverie and spoke. There is, Watson, a curious kinship between the artist and the detective. Both traffic in structure, both pursue beauty. Though one creates it, the other deconstructs it. He picked up the violin and turned it over in his hands, not to play, but to examine, as though some truth might be carved into the wood itself. The artist hides meaning beneath form. The detective peels form back to reach meaning. We move in opposite directions, yet arrive, when fortunate, at the same moment of recognition. I said nothing, for I sensed he was not speaking solely of the case. Valence, he continued, believed in order. He believed that music could contain the universe if only one struck the right chord, and in a sense, he was right. But he made the error of assuming others shared his code of honor. He paused, fingers lightly resting upon the strings. The forger, too, was an artist. His genius lay in deception, and that is always the tragedy of such minds, that their gifts, when unmoored from conscience, tend toward ruin. He looked at me, his eyes sharp beneath the calm. We detect because others conceal. But I confess, there are times I wish I had been born with the urge to compose rather than dismantle. I offered a smile. And yet, Holmes, you have composed justice more than once. To that he said only, justice perhaps, but never harmony. Holmes rose, crossed the room, and opened the window. The air was cool, touched by the scent of distant rain and the faint chiming of a carriage bell far below. He held the violin loosely in his hand. Without preamble, he lifted the bow and drew a single dissonant chord from the instrument, the same combination we had first heard days earlier, played now with solemn precision. It rang out, sharp and unresolved, then faded into the night. He lowered the bow. Some notes, he said, are not meant to resolve. They are meant to remind. And with that, he turned back into the room, closed the window, and placed the violin upon its stand. I made no reply, for in that moment, surrounded by books, shadows, and silence, I understood that the mystery had ended, but its echo, like that final chord, would linger in our minds far longer than sound alone could travel. As we sat once more in our lodgings at Baker Street, Holmes remained at the window, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. The violin rested beside him, silent now, its strings still echoing the discordant chord that had carried so much meaning. There is something singular, he said at length, in the way a man may encode his final cry for help, not in ink, but in music, to hide truth within beauty. That is the artist's privilege. But to uncover it, Watson, that is the burden of the detective. He turned, his face shadowed by thought. It is a curious thing, is it not, that the sharpest lies are sometimes softened by harmony. I nodded, unable to shake the feeling that the case had left a longer echo than most. What do you think was the criminal's greatest miscalculation? Trusting the silence of the room, or underestimating the noise a single note could make? Before you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more mysteries, and if you know someone who would enjoy this story, share it with them and let the music of the mystery play on.